Hi, welcome to Because. I'm your host, Mark Zyla. On this episode of Because, we hear the becauses of international horn soloist and associate professor of horn at the University of Illinois, Bernhard Scully. Bernhard is a member of the University of Illinois Global STEAM Working Group and is Artistic Director of Cormont Music. He spends most of his summer in the White Mountains of New Hampshire as both the Artistic Director of the Kendall Betts Horn Camp and as the horn player of the North County Chamber Players. His solo career has spanned across many genres from classical to jazz and beyond, including being the former longtime horn player of the Canadian Brass and former principal horn of the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra. Among his many awards are top honors at numerous competitions, most notably being the first classical brass player to win a McKnight Fellowship for performing musicians. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks for coming on the show today, Bernhard. How you doing?
I am doing really well. It's so great to talk to you, Mark, and I'm privileged to be on the show.
Let's get started with your early life. Talk to us a little bit about, where you're from and who are some of the people in early Bernhard stories.
Okay. Well, I don't know if people know this. I was actually born into a very musical family. Both my parents are professional musicians. They're both professional pianists. I was born in Minneapolis, or Saint Paul. So I really hail from that region. And then we moved when I was one. We moved to Vermillion, South Dakota. And for those of you that are real big music museum aficionados, it's the home to what's called the National Music Museum, or otherwise known as the Shrine to Music Museum. So the university there houses this museum. And it's like, for those of you that know about music museums, this is like the biggest archival music museum in the world. I'm not kidding.
Well, so is it like instruments or music or just anything music related?
It's everything. This guy who founded it was named Arne Larsen. He was from Norway, because you have like a lot of these, upper European immigrants in that region. He was a collector of musical instruments. Very eclectic instruments, by the way. Like, these are not just the European instruments, but from all over the world. And he began to kind of deposit them at this university, essentially transforming what they had as their kind of regular museum into like a full-blown music museum. And now they have so many instruments that they don't even have enough space to display them.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. So I can imagine as a young person, you probably visited this museum, and what was it like for you to see that?
Yeah.
Early?
So get this. So this museum was 3 blocks away from the elementary school that I went to. So I thought it was like a normal thing to leave elementary school, walk to, down to where my parents were working, but then stop at the museum. And I'd go walk around the first floor and see the whole Stradivarius shop. And I'd see like the whole history of the keyboard. There was a big old Tibetan drum. It looks like a cannon, but like that's the first thing you see, like walking in.
Right.
And in the bottom part, they actually had things like mummies and even like Native American exhibits and things. They eventually moved those things out of the museum as the music museum grew. So it wasn't as big as it is now when I was a kid, but still, I mean, 2 whole floors. You could put a little quarter in the Nickelodeon thing and it would play for you. I mean, it was like, yeah, I mean, it was crazy having that thing in my midst, just 3 blocks away from my elementary school. So my dad taught there. He taught piano, and my mom, she was the collaborative pianist there. Oh. And they also taught privately a lot. So basically I had piano music going on 24/7 in my house. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was I thought it was normal for a family to have like 3 pianos in their houses, like all being used like all the time.
Right. The cacophony of several people practicing in a house at once.
Oh yeah. Like my dad's like practicing Beethoven down in the basement. My mom's practicing Chopin and, Prokofiev upstairs. It's crazy. So that was going on like all the time when I was a kid. So I was kind of immersed in it. We had a big record collection. And I didn't know, I mean, I talked to my students about this now too. I feel really privileged to have that because I know it's not common for people to have that kind of level of access to music. And I mean, of course, that's when MTV was starting too. So I listened to MTV too. So,
Right. Like
so
you're just consuming music in many ways all of the time.
all music, kind of all consumption.
Hmm.
I started. So my parents really wanted me to play violin. That
Hmm.
was they really wanted me to be like a violin player, and I'm a huge disappointment. So they bought me a violin when I was 3. Like I remember
Hmm.
getting it for Christmas, and I started lessons like right away with a local teacher. And I think initially I thought it was cool, and I did Suzuki violin. And
Hmm.
for those who may not know what that is, there's a difference between learning traditional violin, which is quite regimented in the learning, and then there's Suzuki violin, which was it's really, at least theoretically, much more open ended. You don't actually start reading music right away.
Right.
You start learning pieces by ear, and the whole premise is that you learn everything by ear, and then eventually you can start reading music kind of when you're able. And so
Right.
reading music
And,
is hard for little kids, especially. But
right. And
even
it's a way to kind of bake in musicality to young people as they start learning an instrument.
yeah, it's a really interesting. I think it's taught differently. I mean, a lot of it depends on the specific teacher you have, but it's kind of a way. I think Suzuki, who is a very famous Japanese musician who started this learning school, which is for all instruments. I think his concept was, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of meld a combination of the oral learning that happens naturally in musical cultures with the more formal learning that we experience, especially like here in like Western countries with like written music. So kind of combining those things into this unified concept. So I was, this was really cool. My mom teaches Suzuki piano as well. So I had a lot of Suzuki going on. And I do actually remember the day I could actually read music. I was like playing my violin, whatever song I was doing, looking at the music because you always were supposed to look at it. And all of a sudden I made this connection of like what I was playing to the note I was looking at. And
Right.
it's a very vivid memory actually, because up to that point I didn't know what those symbols really meant even. So yeah, I feel privileged to have had that kind of learning too. And I took piano lessons from my parents. I wasn't quite as serious on the piano as I was violin. So I did that all throughout my childhood. The immersion, hearing all the classical music around me. I even played like in little string orchestras. They had like a little youth symphony in Vermilion. I wasn't that good. I mean, I be honest, I really didn't like practicing very much. Like my parents kind of gave up on me after a while because I would rather play outside. So most of my childhood was actually like, you think I was in some sort of, classical music convent or something, but it really was more like me getting home from school, running to the woods, pretty much playing with my friends, building forts, and riding my BMX bike, going off ramps and things. Like that was what I really liked doing, and playing
Right.
Legos,
Right.
and
Right.
I did music as much as my parents kind of essentially kind of forced me to do.
Right.
You
Or
know,
built into your structure of life.
yeah, I really resisted the violin. I think it's because it's hard. I mean, it's hard. The piano I liked because I could sort of sit down and play my pieces.
Right.
I don't have good technique in the piano. I mean, I don't consider myself a pianist. I would be, my parents would disown me if I said I was like a pianist.
Your mom would be calling me asking why I let you say that.
Yeah, exactly. You're not, you know. Um,
Correction, Bernard is not a pianist.
yeah, no, I can push the keys and I can learn things by rote. But so I like that. So I could learn my little pieces by just repeating it. I didn't have to go into all of the foundational stuff that the violin kind of requires you to do, actually, if you're going to learn anything of substance on it. So I just had, I had it around me a lot, but wasn't really that focused or didn't have any intentionality with music until later. So then my dad got a different job in South Georgia, of all places, and Valdosta State University. He got a piano position there, and and that was really cool because I mean it was a different part of the country. It was a big cultural shift for one. I mean, if you've ever lived in like the prairie open barren landscape of South Dakota, then going into like the kind of pseudo tropical deep South nature of South Georgia, like
Yeah,
swamp.
right.
I mean, it was like moving to a different country, actually, truly. But they also have really, really strong music programs down there in terms of bands.
Mhm.
So we were talking just about that a minute ago. So fifth grade, moved down there, and their band didn't start till sixth grade. So I was still doing. We found a violin teacher, but I still was kind of. Violin wasn't my thing. Like I really hadn't got onto it. I was only doing it to kind of make my parents
You
happy.
hadn't developed a connection or a love for it yet,
So
or
actually,
at
kind of,
all.
unfortunately, developed kind of an aversion to it.
Wow.
So
Yeah, yeah.
I really didn't want to. I mean, it was like, oh, that, which is sad to say, because I really wish that I had somehow um, developed more of an affinity for it. Because I really wish I had that skill. I wish I'd kept on with it, because now
Mhm.
I love violin music, and there's nothing against the violin. I mean,
Right,
it's one
right.
of my favorite instruments of all time, and the repertoire is just incredible. So, but for whatever reason, like it just didn't jive with me. It may have had something to do with the fact that it was just my parents kind of. I don't think they meant to do it as much as they were, but they were definitely pushing it, and
Yeah.
I think I was resisting their pressure. So then sixth grade, we got to choose instruments, and my parents kind of told me right away. They said, "Well," because I said I want to play saxophone or trumpet, the
Right.
popular instruments. They're like,
Mhm.
"Nope, you can't." And now I know why they said that. I think they were thinking about college scholarships.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
I love to tell the story about when I went to go visit Oberlin, and we had one of those like financial aid meetings where everybody who was at the visit met with one of the financial aid people. And the first question the person asked was, "Who in this room plays oboe, bassoon, viola, or French horn?" And I was like, right here. She's like, "Y'all are gonna get money."
Yeah, yeah. Can I have that check, please?
Right. Or
So,
double bass is another good one. Play
yeah,
double
right.
bass.
Exactly. So I don't know first. I actually think that they really like those instruments too. They wanted me to play horn because they like the sound of it. I'd like to think that. So in sixth grade, I my first story of trying the horn, because you get to go around and try all the instruments, and I did that just to make sure. When I came to the horn, I was a little kind of prepped for it. I was kind of excited about it, and I thought, okay, this is the one that I think my parents want me to play. I didn't know what buzzing was, and the guy who was at the station didn't know what that was either, actually.
Right.
So I blew into the horn and nothing came out, and I started to become like really kind of embarrassed and sad. And I kept blowing it, and I blew it harder, and like nothing came out. And they're like, "Oh, it's okay. Like you'll probably figure it out. Like you'll play this anyways." And I was, I don't know about that. I couldn't make a sound. So then when I actually when I got my first horn, it was right before school started, and it was my first lesson with my teacher. And my parents had actually bought me this double horn, which again I feel very privileged about, because a lot of students don't get to start on a double horn.
Right.
But they had found it was actually from my band director, who was a really good horn player, and he sold us this horn for a pretty good deal. So my first lesson with my teacher, who was also the horn teacher at Valdosta State, his name is David Mills. And the interesting thing about him is he's been the band director at UConn, University of Connecticut, which is a huge band program, because he was the band director and horn teacher at Valdosta State, like early in his career back then. Then he moved on to UConn, and he's just retiring actually right now. And I've been talking to him a little bit, like chatting with him, and thanked him, because I mean I got to study with him for 2 years. He's a great musician. But my first lesson was with I got this horn. They taught me how to buzz so I could make some sounds, and then it was okay. And I think right at the front of it, I was excited about lessons, and I think there was something about the horn that I think first was very different from what my parents were doing, like with piano, and such a
Right.
totally opposite instrument.
Right. Right.
But I felt like I had a bit of autonomy. But I think I still resisted the lessons, and I still resisted kind of the formal learning. That still wasn't in my line of sight,
Mhm.
because I didn't really own it myself. There was there was no intentionality on my part at that point. I was just kind of going with the
Having
flow,
fun playing an
having
instrument.
fun. I remember a very specific memory in band for our Christmas concert that year, because I hadn't practiced very much. I didn't know all the fingerings. And the
Right.
director looked at me for Jingle Bells. He's like, "All right, play your solo on Jingle Bells." And I didn't know it. So I just played without fingers, and I got like almost all the right notes
Wow.
because it was on the harmonic series.
Right. And you're like very stuck in your ear too, I'm sure. You're like
Well,
forcing the horn to play those notes.
so that's the thing. I think that's the advantage. So for, even though I was essentially a violin dropout and
Right.
piano dropout for that much, but having done all that stuff for so much when I was a kid, I think it actually gave me a really good ear.
Yeah.
And then doing Suzuki as well, because that was all ear based.
Right.
So the horn, not being nearly as technically inclined as those instruments, Jingle Bells was a very easy thing for me to conceptualize, I think. So yeah, I was kind of surprised, like, oh, I can play a lot of songs with very few fingerings. So I almost fooled my band director that day, thinking that I had practiced. But there was like, I think I hit the 11th partial somewhere, and he's like, "Wait, you got a wrong note." And then he realized I didn't know the fingering. So
it's like the time I caught a music education major using the B flat side of the horn and using trumpet fingerings on their horn final.
That's it. No, you almost. Good try.
Not close, but not really.
Isn't it the end of the horn? The valves really don't help that much, but they do help a little bit.
They do.
But then the 7th grade year, band began to kind of ramp up a bit. We did start doing marching band, which I liked. I mean, marching band was never my main thing, but there was something about the culture of that, and like solo and ensemble lessons, I think were getting more interesting to me. And one of the things I started to notice was that when I practiced even a little bit on my horn, whether it was to learn scales or whatever it was, like I felt myself getting better. And then also when I play in the band, I noticed that I was, pretty good even in relation to some of my other peers, even in other instruments. Right. I think and it wasn't like me trying to be better, but there was something about that, it felt good. It felt good to have that sort of acknowledgement because I wasn't that great in sports. I mean, I did some sports pretty well, but I was not like a football star or anything like that. And I think that's one of the really cool things about music is that, anybody of any disposition any background can engage with music, and the art form itself. I think, there are some barriers. Obviously there's barriers of access, there's barriers of privilege, which we could talk more about. But, having said those, just the engagement of the art form, there's a lot of openness to being accepted there, even if you don't have to be the quarterback. You don't have to be the valedictorian necessarily. You can be good on your own. And I think I felt that because I wasn't good at a lot of things,
Right.
So
I've heard some people say that it's like moments like that where you feel like you've quote unquote found your people, and you found like, and for me, it's a lot like over the summers when the orchestra is out, and I don't get to, play with my friends. Like it feels like something's missing. And then when it comes back, you're just like, this feels good.
Yeah, no, totally. You find your people. I mean, there's the whole unfortunately, like the whole band nerd trope, which I take as actually a badge of honor. Like I'm
right. For sure. We are really dedicated to this thing and we get good at it and we think it's super fun. I think that's a formula for a lot of success in a lot of areas.
It is. I mean, it's the same thing as the football team. It's the same thing as the glee club. It's the same thing as the debate team. I mean, they're all people that kind of come together and they start to get better at this one thing and they form a lot of bonds. And
for sure.
So I think I really started feeling that in 7th grade. So
yeah, let's kind of turn the corner and hear the story of what it was like for you to start to see this as something that was going to be what you focused on in the next part of your life.
Yes. And this is a perfect time to transition because literally it was the next year where I started. That was the first summer I started to practice consistently and noticed this real significant improvement in my playing. I think gaining skill for me was a really big motivator. Just the fact that I could do more things, that I would get more acknowledgement for those things. I could play more interesting music by being more skilled, like all of that stuff. Right. I started that began to ramp up a bit more. I started to listen to more music more intentionally. Like I having like a CD or tape actually, but then eventually a CD of Copeland and Bernstein and some of the Russian masters, some pr- awesome repertoire, Tchaikovsky, and really
Right.
starting to notice how it made me feel like when I'd listen to it. Also
Mhm.
noting the really cool horn parts,
Right.
and
There's
then
something for me in there.
yeah, exactly. And not only this, like they're like the star in the orchestra at this moment.
Right.
Um, so a lot of that began to really like my feelings about music really began to coalesce, and it was like to the point where I did not want to not do music,
Right.
because it made me feel so good to do it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then that eighth grade year, for those of you that know me, you might be surprised. I was actually one of the sports I did and I was pretty good at was wrestling.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, because the wrestling
I'm
again,
actually a little surprised, but
you
I
could
can
be
see
surprised.
it. I can see it.
I'm not a big person, and
Mhm.
but in wrestling, it's one of those things where you have weight classes. So I was like in the lower weight class, and the lower
Right.
weight classes are pretty competitive actually, because people
Mhm.
can be like 70 pounds, but they can bench press 250.
Right.
So I was pretty good at wrestling, and it was actually that was a really important thing for me too, because wrestling, like school wrestling like that, the discipline required to do that as a sport was much higher than other sports that I've been involved with.
Mhm.
So like daily cardio, daily strengthening, daily like all this very regimented
Right.
working out.
Weight management.
Weight man. Well, we didn't. Luckily, I didn't get too much into that.
Right.
That's like a little later. I didn't do it. I'll tell you why I didn't
That
continue.
far.
Yeah, I didn't get that competitive, but I was
Mhm.
getting better at it, and it really kind of helped me with my own personal discipline, I think. And I think sports and music really do go hand in hand like that. Um,
Mhm.
and tennis was the other one. And so I was playing a lot of tennis and wrestling, and then in wrestling, I was actually at the point where I was kind of getting up in the ranks, in the state, and there was one of the final matches we had. I was I was beating this guy pretty bad, and then he actually got me in an illegal move, and he threw me down where all of my weight and his weight landed on my arm. And I'll spare any details, but my arm wasn't in the same place like when they hit the ground.
Ugh. Yikes.
And I think that I had to go to the hospital. I mean, I had to stop the whole season. It was traumatic.
Wow.
But that was the first year that I made All-State, because I no longer had any sport. I couldn't do any sports. And so I remember just sitting there for over Christmas break for like 2 weeks, just like, what am I going to do? I guess all I can do is practice my horn, because it was my right arm. And I had, up to that point, I had no interest in doing any competitions or anything like for horn. But that was this time it's like, oh, what else do I got to do? And I made the band. I
Wow.
made All-State band. And
Mhm.
that was a really important thing for me, because it kind of gave me that confidence of like, whoa, I can actually do something pretty significant, because there's only like one band in the state, and I competed against like everybody, and I actually made it, like out of the whatever
Yeah.
six horn players.
Mhm.
So again, the idea of I worked towards something, I put in the effort, and here is a result, and
Right.
I like it. So then by ninth grade, I'd been totally bitten by the music bug by then. I went to a music festival that summer. Um, it was a short music festival, but it was really, really good. Kind of like had everything, band, orchestra. And so the ninth grade came around, and then I was like, I want to do this. Like, I just want to do this.
Right.
And so I started practicing a lot. I started practicing probably, I could sort of see how long I could practice. I would do like an hour. Then I said, I could do that. And then I do like an hour and a half. Then eventually I'm like doing like 2 hours. And I'm doing this like, all I want to do is go home, practice my horn, and, for 2 to 3 hours,
Yeah.
like every day.
Mhm.
And I love the music. I started listening to the Mozart concertos, I listened to Dennis Brain, I listened to Strauss, I'm listening to all, and just like every day begins this whole kind of consumption. I also like jazz too. I was going to do jazz. I did it in eighth grade year, but then the problem was, because the high school band program was competitive, they wanted us to rehearse. There really was no way for me to do both.
Right.
So I kind of like just that went on the back, but I always listened to it.
Right.
That was always kind of one of my first loves of music. I didn't mention that, but like I used to, as much as I listened to Aaron Copland and Bernstein, I'd listen to Charlie Parker and Freddie Hubbard and Herbie Hancock. I mean,
Mhm.
if not more actually.
Right.
So, and I always wished I could do that.
Mhm.
So, and one of my teachers at that point I had another private teacher starting in eighth grade, Mark Belsick, another amazing guy. So lucky to get these teachers. He took over when David Mills left the school. He said something to me that was very fortuitous because I mean I had discovered Canadian brass actually, like most young players. We saw the
Yep.
videos, we saw them play live. It was like, oh, the group.
Right.
And I said, I think I said something like, well, how would you do that? And he's like, well, if you practice all your scales and arpeggios and you can do this, maybe one day you'll be able to play in that group. I'm not kidding.
Foreshadowing everybody.
I don't know. I mean, it's just,
Right.
that wasn't the only reason, but it was, I wanted to practice all my scales and arpeggios just because I thought, like, if I can do all this stuff, then I'll be able to play the music that I like. Then
Right.
I'll be able to play in the groups that I'm really inspired by because I kind of had made that connection of it will take this work,
Right.
Then continued on, kept doing more and more, getting more and more involved, more and more immersion. And then by middle high school, we moved back to the Twin Cities. My family moved back up there to be close to our family. My first, what I would call real mentor on the horn, because I'd had some really good teachers. I wouldn't necessarily call them mentors because I was very young, wouldn't have known even how to be mentored probably. But then at the moment I was really desiring a mentor, somebody to be more involved in my life. I met Kendall Betts, and he was principal horn of the Minnesota Orchestra. I had seen him play at the 1993 Horn Convention, which is in Tallahassee, which is just an hour south of where I lived. My teacher took me down there for one day, and he was one of the performers, along with many, many others, including like Barry Tuckwell, and it was a who's who, of course, there. And I remember seeing Kendall and reading his biography, thinking like, well, he's the first horn of that symphony, and I should probably call him. And so I contacted him in the fall when I moved down, and he was willing to take me as a student. And I also got into a youth symphony because where I lived in Georgia, we didn't really have many symphonies to play. There was one that was kind of far away that I couldn't really do. But in the Twin Cities, there was two really good ones, and I auditioned for both of them, actually, because I just really wanted to play. And I got in both. And Kendall took me as a student. And those next 2 years were where I really, to this day, I think that's where I put a lot of things together. I mean, he had me basically just do fundamentals. Like, he wouldn't let me play anything until I could play all the Coprache. Coprache, for those who don't know, is sort of like the wax on, wax off of Karate Kid. That's like me painting my teacher's house,
right?
for days on end.
I think the thing that's interesting about that book, sorry to jump in, but it's like, so I had never played Coprache the way I played Coprache with you, and now my students play Coprache like you taught me to play Coprache, which I'm sure is the way you were taught to teach Coprache. So it's like, it's one of these things where it's like it's not the Bible, but it is like a horn Bible that we pass down to our generations. And it's really interesting like that, I think.
Well, I think one of the reasons I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I mean, that makes me really happy as a teacher and a friend, and I'm glad it was successful. I mean, I like to think that I don't like to teach things to people unless I think I know they're going to be useful to them. So I'm glad it was so useful.
Yeah. You said you need to just sound prettier all the time, and here's how you're going to do it. And you know what? I started sounding prettier all the time.
You got that orchestra job right away.
Yeah. I did. I got it right away.
Well, I would say about that. So I think one of the reasons it's used so much is that it's just simply so simple. Like, it's like you took any piece of music and just distilled it into the most basic. It's almost hard to rewrite Coprache because it's so basic, right?
Right.
You'd have to write like a long note.
Right. It's literally just a book of long tones.
And that's also what we worked on. I mean, it was like, long tones and Coprache scales. Right. It's just fundamentals, and I still teach it. I still, practice it. But that's what Kendall was all about. And I did that with him for 2 years. He just kicked my butt up and down with that stuff. And he also became a really important person in my life. Like, I didn't know at the time, but he was going to become really one of these, not the most influential musical guides and friends of my life, So had these 2 years, he helped me get into college, and I ended up going to Northwestern University, which is where I really wanted to go, because I was really obsessed with like Chicago Symphony and Gail Williams. These were heroes of mine as well.
And it was a lot of really great young horn players were going there. I mean, still to this day, but that was a great era. at that time.
Yep, it was like Arnold Jacobs was still living.
Hmm.
Yeah, Chicago was a real mecca for brass and wind players, and I'd known that for some time. Once I kind of became pretty serious, that became very clear to
Hmm.
me that that was a destination moment, a destination point to really shoot for. And
Hmm.
also the school itself, I was really interested in academics, and Northwestern are very, offered really strong academics, so I could have that outlet as
Absolutely.
well. So I went there, and that the next 4 years were just like the next level of intensity in terms of, it was all about shoring everything up so I could go and work in the profession and hopefully get paid. And my only goal at that point really was, I just wanted to be able to make a living as a horn player. I didn't really have specific goals. I was a little less vocationally focused than a lot of my friends who really were gunning for like actual jobs. Like,
Right.
like right away, they'd tell me like, I'm going to get out of school because I can get my job. Now I just didn't understand that mentality, because actually I kind of like school. So like a lot of
Right.
this stuff actually makes sense for me now. Like I'm at the university because
Right.
I like school, but that was kind of, I was kind of weird in that environment where everyone's like trying to get out of school. And I'm like, I kind of like this.
Can I stay?
I know. I was like, I kept on thinking like, well, a job means that I have to like work for somebody, right? Like, how do I want to do that?
I didn't get down to the like living part of things.
Well, I knew the money, but it's just this idea of like a job sounds so in my very, novice mind. It just wasn't something I thought of. It sounded so illustrious in some ways, like a job rather than like,
Right.
you know, an artistic vision or something. I mean, that was, I was kind of a different way of describing it, but I
Love
loved
it.
going to school. I loved school. I just, and I essentially tried to take as many non-music classes as I could. I was really interested in philosophy. I effectively minored in composition. I'm really interested in writing music.
Hmm.
I also took voice lessons. Um, I played some in the Civic Orchestra of Chicago when I was there, so I got some really significant experiences orchestrally.
Hmm.
And just, to try to take it, I just loved it so much. I try to take advantage of every aspect of it. I don't think I was necessarily the best student. I mean, I didn't get the LAs, but I devoted myself as much as I could. And the other big thing happening at this point, I forgot to mention, in high school, with Kendall, my senior year in high school, he took a sabbatical from the orchestra to work on what he was calling his Horn Camp project.
Hmm.
And I didn't know what he was talking about. But he was planning to do this camp in the summer for just French horns. And then right after I graduated high school, he asked me if I would drive up to across the country, actually, to New Hampshire, where he was going to have it, to do this camp. It was 1 week, and there's three faculty: him, David Ohanian, who was in Canadian brass at the time,
Hmm.
and his friend Abby Mayer, who had been in the West Point Band and Indianapolis Symphony, and retired. So I just thought, yeah, sure, I'll go, I'll go help you with your camp, Mr. Betts at the time. And I went up there, and it was just like, I had no idea what to expect, but it was like horn heaven. So then every summer after that, he had this camp, and it began to grow, and I would go pretty much every summer, kind of helping him out and learning as a student. And what I didn't know is that that camp was going to become such a bigger part of my life over time.
Hmm.
So Northwestern, did all that stuff. Then I graduated, and I really needed a break after I graduated from college because I was very burned out from just everything, like a lot of
Right.
people are. I didn't want to go right into grad school. I hadn't really done too many auditions at that point. I was
Hmm.
just trying to like kind of like calm down just a bit to get a lay of the land. But so I actually went back to Minnesota really just for the summer. But then my first professional experiences ended up being, um, interestingly enough, I don't know if you know this, Ian Hobson who's our conductor of Symphony to Camera and one of our amazing piano faculty here at University of Illinois. He was
Hmm.
my chair music coach at a music festival I went to that summer. And
Right.
at the end of the festival, he asked me if I would want to join this group he had called Symphony to Camera.
Hmm.
I didn't know it from Adam or anything. I was like, a job? Yeah, you had me on a
Sure.
look. And I got another position close to where I grew up in the South Dakota Symphony. They have actually a really good symphony over there.
Hmm.
I don't know, it's probably a little similar to like Quad City Symphony.
Yep.
Local orchestra, they have some full-time players.
Hmm.
So I got a part-time position there. So I was kind of like starting my freelance career, going around right at the end of August to do these various places. And then Minnesota Orchestra, where my teacher was still playing, teacher had told me that there was going to be a retirement in the horn section because one of them, he was approaching retirement, one of the horn players, and maybe had some health issues or something, and they were going to need a replacement eventually. And I kind of got me thinking about it. So then, sure enough, that very moment, they asked me to sub in the orchestra. Like after they knew I'd been getting these other gigs, so they kind of had, and he had confidence in me, so he asked me to start subbing with the orchestra, initially on the third horn when this other guy was out. And so eventually, at the end of the year, the orchestra asked me, like what I was going to do is I was going to at that point go to grad school at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where my teacher Gail Williams had recommended that I do grad school with Doug Hill, who's a very famous teacher. And I got into the school and met Doug. But then at the end of the year, the symphony, they said, well, we're not going to hire somebody full time for another couple of years till we have a director search. And so they kind of asked me to stay longer in the area so that I could keep working with them. They liked my playing. And that was for me then the real, like, that was my next level training.
Right.
Because I really wasn't good enough to like get in the orchestra at that point. I mean, I didn't have enough experience or perspective. I was good.
Right.
I just was not as disciplined as I needed to be. I was too interested in many other things.
Right.
And, pretty lucky actually. I think, I was definitely in a situation where I had to learn fast, but I learned very fast. And that was that moment where it's like, I realized if I don't play at least as well as the other players around me, like they're not going to ask me back, So I had to get as good as that. And then I started thinking, like, if I really want this position in the end, whenever it's going to open up, I have to probably display that I can play better than them. So then they hire me.
And you kind of have to learn the approach of the orchestra sometimes.
Yes. Well, that's the one thing Northwestern did for me that was really good is they were very focused on auditioning. So I did have a good sense of like preparing for auditions and all of that. So that was a little less unfamiliar to me, but the whole, like, being a colleague in an orchestra at that level, like playing consistently at all times, at that, being a good call, listening and just all these things, being so flexible, like that was, I had a big learning curve with that, but that's where I learned how to do that stuff. And I got to sit next to my teacher, and now it wasn't just him telling me, to play Koprash. Now it's like me playing with him, as assistant horn or second horn or third horn, because it was kind of a rotating position at that point. Getting into the sound, really learning. I feel so grateful for that because, again, it gave me more of a chance to learn from him. He became a totally different kind of a teacher for me at that point. But then, I did that for 3 years, essentially played almost full time in this orchestra. It was like almost every week I was playing, and various positions. And sometimes I even did some first horn, like in Pops concerts and stuff,
Right.
So just, it was great training. But I still wasn't where I was at. And one of the things I began to notice at that moment, the next transition for me, because I was now like 23, 24, was that I really wanted to do a couple other things. Like there was things that I felt the orchestra really was wonderful for, but I really wanted to throw my hat in the ring for solo playing, for one.
Right.
Do more chamber music. I wanted to focus more on my composing, and also jazz, which is something I sort of had put off in my life since I was a kid, and just wanted to give myself a chance to just become more versed in the art form. Even though French horn typically has not been thought of as a jazz instrument, but I just loved it. So,
right.
And Doug Hill was the person. I think that's one reason Gail was so keen on me going there, because he was a person that was going to support me. When I told him, like, he's like, "Why do you want to go to school now?" I was like, "Well, I want to focus on solo playing and jazz and composition." He's like,
it's like,
"Great,
perfect.
I'll support you and all that stuff." What I didn't say was like orchestra excerpts,
Yeah.
I didn't even mention it. But he was like all about it, because he had built his career in a similar way. He was mostly a soloist. He was a very innovative jazz artist, actually, very prolific composer to this day. And again, what I didn't realize at that point was I was also going to meet my next mentor,
Mm-hmm.
which was Doug. Doug was
Right.
in a very different kind of chapter in my life. So basically, and it was a really interesting point because I had an opportunity to take another, not a part-time, it was a full-time position, but it was like on a 1 or 2 year term,
Mm-hmm.
in another very good symphony. And it was similar position. It was a fourth horn this time.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was offered a fellowship, which was a really cool deal at Wisconsin, where Doug taught, to
Right.
focus on these new interests of mine. And I actually decided to choose the focus on my interests, because I thought to myself, like, I'm getting older, and at a certain point, I won't be able to do these things.
Right.
It's harder and harder, especially as you get more life responsibilities to focus on passion projects, I would say.
Right.
So I really wanted to give myself a chance to do this. And so I moved to Madison. I did a recital every semester, learning more repertoire. I began to do solo competitions. I took
Mm-hmm.
jazz lessons. I wrote music. Doug was he was there with me the whole 100% of the way. And by the way, he's like the most amazing teacher I think I ever had. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he could teach anybody. Like, he could teach a fish how to breathe air. I'm not kidding. Like, the dude was
Yeah.
just a talent on that level. And Gail said as much too. She's like, and she was, one of the greatest teachers of all time too, for her to say that.
Mm-hmm.
So just getting to work with him, and Madison was very cool. It's a very cool place. And I also did work. I kept my symphonic roots there too. I got in the Madison Symphony.
Mm-hmm.
I got in the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra. Those are the two professional orchestras in the region. I kept on doing a little subbing with Minnesota Orchestra at the time, so I kind of kept my foot a little in. But I was kind of thinking, like, well, this is my time to really focus on myself and things that I really wanted to give myself a chance to do. And I gave it everything. I mean, I really put in all I had. And then once I graduated with my master's degree, my big goal was to do these European competitions, which, like, Munich is the real big one. There was one at that time in Geneva. These were competitions. If you won them, they would you'd get sponsored by the state, actually, to become like a soloist. And the repertoire was very vast.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone told me I shouldn't, like, a lot of people were telling me, like, why are you doing all this stuff? Like, why are you not focusing on your excerpts and all this?
Right.
I was just like, well, because I can always do that. And I just want to take some time for myself. And the same thing with the competition. It's like, why are you doing that? You're never going to win. I mean, because they don't hire, they don't choose Americans. They don't like Americans. I'm just like, well, how do you know?
Right.
You haven't heard me yet,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell those of us who may not have experience in a competition like that, what do they ask for? What does that look like?
It was substantial. Like, it was by far the most thing I've ever prepared for anything. There are a couple competitions in these parts that are very substantial also, but you're probably dealing with maybe a little over an hour of repertoire for some competitions here. There, I mean, it was a good over 2 hours of music.
Wow.
That I had to memorize. You wouldn't want to go there and not have it memorized.
Mm-hmm.
There was a new piece of music that had been written for the competition that was almost impossible, that I learned. That my wife still holds over my head for having to practice that, like, every night.
She's like, she hears it. She's like, not again.
Not that piece. Yeah. So, but it was really a lot. I mean, it was, so I spent like 7 months. It was, the first one I was going to do was in Geneva, Switzerland, because that was the first one that was coming up in the cycle of them. They kind of happened like every other year, or every year that a new one would come up. And I figured, like, well, I'll try this first one out, and then I'll hopefully do the other ones. And I was playing in those synth. I was making, for somebody that was newly married. Well, I should say that too. I mean, my other half of my life. I mean, I gotten engaged and married, and I met Sarah in Minnesota. When I was still there. And then we didn't get married till 1 year after I was in Madison. She kind of transitioned down. So now we're like new married couple in Madison. I'm working, sort of 2 really good part-time jobs. She has a job. So we're doing fine, like, as like a single couple. And now I'm spending all my extra time just practicing solo music, memorizing all this stuff. And so I do the first, and I also set a bunch of recitals for myself to prepare. So I did a recital in Madison, I did a recital in Northwestern, I did a couple other ones, and I felt really ready to go. We went over there, and even it was cool. Even her parents, my wife's parents, came over to support me, which is really cool.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we had like 2 weeks in Switzerland. So I was the only person actually. There was like a tape round, and you had to pass that round, and I was the only American person there.
Wow.
So I don't know how many people applied, probably not very many, but it was mostly, continental European players that were there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good experience. And I pretty much played as good as I possibly could have played at the competition. I didn't really get anywhere with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was like, I couldn't play any better,
Right.
And I thought, and I wasn't defeatist about it, but I was just like, well, I think, I'm going to keep doing these things. And this is such a great experience, but I'm going to now probably refocus myself on probably the orchestra editions again,
Right.
To be a little more maybe practical about it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I got back from the trip, and we'd spent like a week in Zermatt, Switzerland, to just kind of celebrate just being over there. And it was fun. Her parents were there. And it was the day after I got back that I got a call from one of my former teachers from Northwestern that said, "Oh, Gene and Chuck, they have a horn opening now. They need a horn. Like, are you interested?" And I was like, "Gene and Chuck, like from the Canadian Brass?" And he's like, "Yeah. They, are you interested in that?" And I was just like, yeah. And what I thought they meant was that they needed like a horn player for a concert or something.
Right.
Like they were coming to town. They needed someone to play. I was like, "Oh yeah, sure." And they go, "All right, well, Gene will call you." And so then the trombone player of the group, Gene Watts, if I remember the Canadian Brass, he called me. He's like, "Well, yeah, we're looking for a horn player. Would you like to come and audition for us? We got your name from so and so." They apparently called different teachers. And I was like, "Oh, well, okay." And they're like, "Yeah, Jeff's leaving. We need someone to come in. We have like a Asian tour." And I was like, "Oh, when do you want me to come in?" Like, "Well, we need you to come in this weekend," which was like 4 days from then.
Right.
It was like Tuesday. They wanted me to come in on Saturday. They were soloing with the Philadelphia Orchestra Brass Ensemble, and they had the whole series of concerts. So I had to fly to Philadelphia. So I was like, "Okay." And the guy said, "What do you want me to play?" And they said, "Well, just come play with the quintet." And when we heard you do a lot of solo playing, so why don't you play like, a solo recital for us? Okay. No problem.
Yes, sir.
We got my flight all set up. I flew to, Philadelphia. I got in, I like left at 4 a.m. or something, some ungodly hour. And then I got there early, and then I met all their people. Talking about people, like there was like the Yamaha folks, there was the symphony folks, there's they were there, and I had lunch with them. And the first thing I did was like go backstage, and it's like they want me to play with the quintet. I played the quintet for like an hour. They just like kept throwing music at me, stuff I'd never seen.
Right.
And it was all happening very fast. Then I had to get up and I played all my solo music for them. And then we did it again the next day. Then I saw the concert, and I did it again the next day. After I was all done, I had a nice dinner with the Chuck and Gene, who, were the leaders of the group. And they said, "Well, we got this big Asian tour, we're hearing a couple other players, so we'll let you know in a couple of days, whether we hire you." So it was literally like 2 days later, they called me and they said, "We want to hire you."
Wow.
I was like, "What?"
Right.
I just figured like that was a cool experience, and I was not anticipating, actually. I just, didn't know. And
Right.
from the way, so then it was like a month later. I said, "When do I start?" He goes, "Well, in a month, we want you here in Toronto, and here's the book." I gave me this big old book of music.
Right.
And I talked to some people, about it, and they said, "Well, what they're saying is they want you to memorize this music."
That book.
And so now to kind of like take a little step back. So this is now what's becoming like basically the beginning of my actual real authentic career now. Like,
Mhm.
I have all these really great experiences, then definitely I was professional horn player at a high level, but I don't think I'd really come into my own yet. And I
Right.
really hadn't found my voice. But then when I went to Madison, that was what I was really doing, as I was trying to find my own voice as an
Right.
artist, and really have that confidence that I have something to say,
Mhm.
and I want to say it through
Right.
solo music, through my compositions, through jazz, regardless if it had any monetary or vocational outcomes. I didn't even know.
Right.
you know?
Right.
So now I have this experience that really now, if I had not done that, if I had not taken those 2.5 years of intensive refocusing, there's no way they would have even called me, for one. And and even if I did, I wouldn't have been remotely prepared to do
Right.
what they were going to do.
Yeah.
Just
Because
go
like
around the world playing essentially solo concerts.
right, and to then be presented with a book that the expectation is memorization,
Yeah.
you can't just like turn that skill on.
That goes back to my Suzuki stuff too,
Right.
you know.
Absolutely.
But it also had been recharged by the competitions.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
So
it was tying into a lot of things, and my face was there. I mean, the big thing with the quintet was this is a whole nother level of endurance and stamina that I hadn't never really faced except for doing a solo recital. So now
mhm,
getting more, my learning curve with that group was not only the memorization, and there's choreography too, but it was
right.
also the physical nature of it. You know,
Hmm.
I had to it took me about a year in the group to really feel like I was able to be feel remotely consistent. I think I was playing consistently, but I still felt not totally comfortable
Right.
just getting out there and playing. And that was different too, because now you're out on stage, and like, unlike the orchestra, oftentimes where people are looking at you, but there's a lot of people on stage, and you're not
Hmm.
necessarily like just focusing on the audience. Now it's like I'm the only person up there who's playing the horn.
Right.
You know? So
any
I'm standing
any
front.
horn interested people are looking at me right now.
Yeah, we're really like, like looking at them, like, interacting with the audience. So for me, again, it's a huge learning curve, but I really felt like it was such a great learning experience. So I did 3 years of that, and then I wasn't necessarily going to leave. I was having time of my life. I mean, it was like pre-kids. Sarah and I were married. We decided to live in Rochester, New York, which is kind of close to Toronto because she got a job up there, which is a really nice place to live. And had no reason to leave the group or anything. It was like I kind of was feeling like I want to stay in this group. But then we decided that was the year we really wanted to try for our first baby. We're both 30 at that point. So that's kind of one of our things we talked about when we first got married. And so sure enough, Sarah was pregnant. And I was just thinking, since I had so much time off, even though I was gone a lot, but when I was home, I didn't have any other responsibilities.
Right.
So I thought, okay, this could work. But it wasn't, it was, um, yeah, close to the time of her giving birth to our first child, Ellie, um, when the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra, which was the other orchestra in the Twin Cities, that I hadn't really worked with very much. I occasionally would sub with them. They didn't need extra horns very much, and the repertoire didn't allow for much of that. But I certainly knew some of the players, but didn't really have a strong history with that group. But they needed a principal horn, and they had been looking for quite some time, and they got my name somehow, and they asked me initially just to play a concert week with them,
Hmm.
and it miraculously worked out like in the middle of my touring schedule. It was after Ellie had been born,
Hmm.
and I just went, and it was like a concert of modern music. It was really challenging, but really fun. And then after I played the concert, they were like, well, we need a principal horn. We really like your playing. Would you be interested in this job? And I said, like, okay,
Right.
again, I wasn't planning on leaving the quintet or anything. It would certainly hadn't crossed my mind, but this was not only a really great orchestra job, but it was also like where we're from,
Right.
because our whole family was up there. Her family,
Hmm.
my family were stomping grounds. My former orchestra colleague, my teacher was up there. Actually, at that
Right.
point, he was not playing at that point, but just a lot of connections in Minnesota for sure.
Right. So it kind
So
of
I
felt
just
like
thought, like,
going
this,
home a little bit.
yeah, like the universe is like telling me I should be doing this, and plus we
Hmm.
now have a baby, and this would be a great place to raise the baby.
Right.
So I took their audition. They had like a really, really difficult audition that I agreed to take, and I took the audition, and they hired me. I had to do a couple of trial weeks, and then I was able to transition away from the brass. I didn't, again, it was an amicable parting, and I ended up going back and playing some with the brass, and I've established a strong relationship with them. I think they
Hmm.
understood, that this was going to make more sense for me, right now for family,
Right.
and it was great. And so that was with that orchestra for 3 years, and
Hmm.
it was really high quality music making. It was a really different repertoire than I had played. It was a lot of classical repertoire, Mozart, Haydn symphonies, really high horn, a
Hmm.
lot of modern music. They were doing like a ton of it. So every month we'd have, 2 concerts of music that was just modern music. So there's a lot
And
of
you made one of the best Brandenburg recordings I've ever heard.
oh,
You
which
shared with me a live recording
okay, yeah,
when
we
I
did
was in
Brandenburg
school.
Concerto a
You,
lot.
yeah, I just remember you and I think it was Paul Straka playing second on the one that
Yes.
I heard, and y'all just went nuts with your ornaments on the second time. It was awesome.
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of that stuff was unconducted. That was the other thing. The
Right.
orchestra didn't have they'd moved into a model where they didn't have a conductor. They had artistic partners and like stuff like that. We would oftentimes do like without conductor, which was
Hmm.
super fun. I mean,
Right.
it was some of the non-conducted stuff was kind of scary, but that was
Right.
Beethoven symphonies. Those were scary. So yeah, and that was just it was great. And then it was great for Ellie, our firstborn, to have all of her family to grow up around. We went to the same church we got married in
Wow.
because her dad is a pastor in a church, and we just lived like down the street from it. So it was like all the universe forces were there, and that's when I think my kind of what I consider now my solo career was beginning to burgeon.
Hmm.
I got some requests to play like in some horn conventions, and I started to do some other soloing, whether it was concerto or chamber music, and teaching as well. So and then at that point, I had been teaching on faculty at the horn camp.
Hmm.
Once I got in the Canadian brass, that was, I think, to Kendall, was kind of like, this is a very significant
Right.
thing that would qualify. And I'd shown some aptitude for teaching, but the horn camp was where I really kind of began to cut my teeth on teaching, because you're working with really hungry students in this environment. I could talk much more about the horn camp. I know we're limited on time, but
Yeah.
if you have any questions about that, we should maybe put a link to the horn camp.
Oh, we definitely will have one in there.
Something. If you're a horn player, you should consider the horn camp. It's pretty cool. But that's where I really started cutting my teeth on teaching, and then I started being asked to do more teaching after that. One of the disadvantages of being in Minneapolis was there was no teaching outlet for me there, really.
Right.
The University of Minnesota already had a horn teacher. St. Olaf they already had horn teachers, and I think for lack of it's not that it wasn't like a vibrant music learning community, but there wasn't as much of it going on as, say, there was in like Chicago or something,
Right.
So I did most of my teaching elsewhere, like in music festivals and whatnot. So I think when the opportunity to come to the University of Illinois presented itself to me, there was a number of compelling reasons. And I think the most important reason being I just love teaching, and this was going to be a place where I could really do that on a significant level.
Mm-hmm. And they had a really strong doctoral horn TA at that time.
They did. The best.
Who just so happens to have a podcast.
Right. Yes. Who also happened to make my life very easy because he was so conscientious and knew so much about the school.
Yes. This is how things run here, buddy.
pretty much Mark, he taught me the lay of the land when I first got here. And he's like, look, this is the way it works. And it was a pleasure. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like, I think all the students I've had have been amazing, but I mean, just having you as a student and the ones who were there, Steve and Jamie and Natalie and so many others that were there that were all great. Mm-hmm. I think you were just, I mean, it was overwhelming how good it was, and just in terms of the people I was working with. And
it was a really cool place because there were, like, I think all kinds of students in that studio. Mm-hmm. Where, like, for me at that time, I think I remember early lessons being like a little bit of, well, I don't care about that. I want to get an orchestra job. And you being like, well, I mean, I'm saying this is going to help you get that orchestra job. Right. It's not just pounding excerpts. It is, developing a more marketable palette of sound and all that kind of
it's
stuff.
Like you were like Ralph Macchio going like, come on, Mr. Miyagi, teach me some karate. He's like, all right, paint my house.
Yeah, right, exactly.
What are you trying to do,
Right. I tell my students
this. Help me paint my office, by the way.
I tell my students this story all the time, where it's them. I'm trying to convince them that free buzzing and mouthpiece buzzing is valuable, like, practice time. Like, it's not just a trick or a punishment in lessons. It's like an approach. And I remember it's like, you asked me in one of the first lessons, you're like, hey, do you free buzz or mouthpiece buzz? I was like, I ain't got time for that. I got to play my horn. Just like, but like a DMA level student who feels like he plays the horn pretty well, breaking it back down to just going was like awesome. But I tell them, it's like, I learned from that experience that like set that like emotion aside and just say, hey, I'm going to give this a shot. And for me, like it unlocked it. So
you were really kind to me too. I was a little, I think I was feeling fairly confident in my teaching abilities, but I think where I was not confident was that I still wasn't that old, to be quite honest, like to be teaching and overseeing people. I mean, you are younger than me, but maybe not by that much,
Right.
And Steve Burry, I think, is older than me, actually.
Right.
So, Jamie Campbell is, I think, as old as I am. And so I felt there was a little bit of discomfort there where, oftentimes we think of teachers as these people who are older than us. But, you were all very kind to me, and, you did grant me a lot of grace, as a new teacher there. And I'm grateful for that.
No.
You didn't have to be. You could have been like I could be like the substitute teacher.
Like, can't wait to get out of here. Yeah. No, it was a really wonderful time. So let's take the next 5 minutes or so and kind of go speed round a little bit. Yeah. So you're now at the University of Illinois, tenured at the University of Illinois.
Yeah.
Right? And the university setting gives you a platform to do a lot of creative things.
Yes.
And you have evidence in that in terms of the solo record you put out with your mother accompanying you.
Yeah.
To the work you did with Gunter Schuler a few years ago. Talk to me about that landscape for you and, what our listeners might look forward to in the future from an artist such as yourself with these tools at his disposal.
Oh, thank you for asking that. Yeah, it's quite a remarkable place, the university, because I think as musicians, especially like people that are trained to be working classical musicians, I mean, both you and I have that commonality, where we're oftentimes taught to, like, we're going to play in the ensemble and we're essentially going to be told what to do. I don't think we think about that when we're little, but starting in band, it's like, it's quite an autocratic art form in many ways. Not that that's bad. It's kind of necessary, to play, make ensemble playing really well. But we're oftentimes not made to believe like, oh, you can just like create your own thing, And so for me, coming here, for all the abilities to think openly, it took me a while to actually kind of reframe my thinking. I think I was predisposed. I think that's when I felt resonance with it, because I think I do like it. I remember Doug Hill talking to me about that, because I asked him, like, well, what do you like about the teaching job? He's like, well, I like the freedom.
Right.
But since I didn't know what freedom was, I didn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
I'm serious.
What does that look like?
Like, right. I was to show up and play what I'm told. That's what music is, right?
Right.
I'm not supposed to think for myself. And but this is like a place where it's not only that, but the idea of like self-governance, like within a university, is very interesting. The faculty senate. I mean, it's a whole democratic body, like all the faculty and the way it functions. It's highly complex. Decisions are made by committee and voting. It's all about, people's what they want to do in their research, and their teaching is at their purview. There's no standardized form of teaching. There's no standardized form of research or anything. And so I think it took me a little while to kind of gain my footing. In fact, I mean, one of the things I did, I actually rejoined my old group, the Canadian Brass, which shows you also the flexibility within the university that they would allow me to do that, because that was a full-time job.
Right.
So I did 2 full-time jobs, and it was too much. That also taught me that was, for me at least, too much research, too much performing away.
Right.
For a balance in my life. I did it for my promotional periods. They counted it as research. It was very high end playing. But it also showed me just the sheer latitude of what's possible at the university. It's like, wow, you can literally like do this. They let you do that,
Right.
They don't take off your pay. If I wanted to leave the orchestra to do anything, I had to either like get serious, like leave of absence kind of stuff, and they usually wouldn't pay me.
Right. Yeah.
And
If
they
it's
wouldn't
beyond
normally
your
let me do it.
vacation time.
They wouldn't normally let me do it. So I think the
Yeah.
university, not only from a research standpoint, but also my interest, like in solo playing, where I go off and do something, it's, I think, one of the only kind of bases of operation you could have for such a thing, to give you that kind of freedom to go away and for the university to value it. So I think that
Right.
that kind of gives listeners a little perspective. You think of like someone like Indiana Jones, like they, he was the professor or wherever, and he went, and the university is just kind of allowing it. It's actually true.
Right.
I mean, it's actually
Yeah.
kind of,
And he had all that time to go on these great adventures.
right. So from a research standpoint, I think what it's allowed me to do, I mean, first of all, it's allowed me to teach and evolve my teaching, which has been a real joy for me, really fascinating. It's allowed me to develop, these wonderful relationships with my students as human beings. It's a really cool thing. So every day is like a different day,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of help them all develop where they're at. Cause not everybody wants to do the same things that I've done. Most of them don't, actually.
Right.
You're one of the only ones that probably done something similar.
Right. I was like, yeah, I want to do what you're doing.
Right. But that's cool,
Right.
but that's the cool thing about the university is it's really a place, as you were saying before, it's like a place for a lot of different people, that can have success in a lot of different ways. And that was always very interesting to me as a teacher, to try to help people have success in the way that they're defining it, obviously offer my expertise and input to help that path and obviously build excellence into it. But
Right.
Everyone's different. So that's been interesting. And then in terms of my own projects, the most recent thing I think is now kind of dealing with, I joined this group a couple of years ago during the pandemic called the Global STEAM. That stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. And you sometimes hear about STEM, which is minus the A.
Mm-hmm.
Arts.
Right. Minus the heart.
Right. And so I have a engineering student here, and I started teaching her when she was a freshman, and she asked me if she could take lessons. And I think that's another great thing about this university is we have all these amazing students across the campus that many of them can really play. They want to learn.
Right.
So I've always been very, very open to teaching non-major students when they want to really
do the work.
Yeah,
and
they're
study.
Willing to do the work and willing to commit. I will definitely teach them. And everybody has so far. So Jessica was very interesting. I'm just going to use her first name. She came in, and that was the year I had stepped down again from the quintet because I really wanted to now focus. I got tenure at the university, and the other cool thing, tenure kind of means like you can not just job security, but now I realize it means that I can teach and research in ways that I want. And again, that's very contrary to, I think, a lot of the ways musicians are taught to think. Like, what do you mean? Like, what do I want? Because wouldn't it just be this? It's like, well, actually, I'd been thinking a lot about there are some changes I think I'd like to explore in all of that. And one of it is to include more creativity in my teaching, including like improvisation. I'd done a little bit of that, like when you were there, but not very much. Improvisation, composition, just more interdisciplinary kind of thinking,
Right.
And so I started doing this like on scales, like improvising, just having the students improvise on their scales, meaning like here's a C major scale, you create something with it. And you may not believe this, but like most of the students, they would just say like, well, I can't do that.
Right.
She was one of them. She's like, I can't do that. I said, I think you can. She's like, I can't improvise. Like, we've been improvising with language the whole lesson. You and I have been improvising with language the whole lesson, you and me.
Right. This is unscripted.
Right? And she's like, oh, yeah. And so she kind of thought, so the next lesson she came in and she sort of did something. I said, see, you did it. And she's like, okay, well, how do I know I'm doing it right? I said, well, that's the thing. It's like, there's not really a right or wrong with this. I mean, we're using the scale. So if you're playing out, that's a parameter we're setting. And I'm also kind of assessing your knowledge of the scale too. So it's not like we're just doing anything. We are definitely, we have a rubric here, but I'm asking you to. And so what happened especially with her, she's an engineer. Engineers tend to not, maybe she's told me, not think like this so much at all, actually.
Right.
By the end of the semester, she was writing her own music based on improvisations, and she was loving it. and she's not even very trained in music theory like a lot of us because she's not in the music school.
Right.
And a lot of the students began doing this. So it began to kind of shift the culture a bit. And we're still playing Mozart. We're still playing Brahms. It's like we haven't cut anything out. We
Mm-hmm.
add a bit more time now towards this other element of music making, which I always wished was more part of my training. You know,
Right.
it usually has been taken out of most training. Or you think like, well, I'm not a jazz musician. Well, it's like, how come jazz artists are the only ones that can improvise?
Right. It's
That's
like the equivalent of the like high school math class thing. When am I ever going to use this?
right. Well, now when people say that, kind of in your comment earlier, it's like
Right.
people say, well, how's it going to help me get a job? I'll say, well, tell me how it can't.
Exactly.
Just like the
Right.
fundamentals. It's like maybe this is not actually playing to Eulenspiegel, but if you can think like a composer, if you have the kind of ability on your horn to create things like
Right.
the composers that you're playing for the audition, think how much better you will play this
Right.
music.
It's certainly not going to hurt your Till Eulenspiegel to be able to improvise.
No.
Right.
I mean, even if you only write one piece of music, at least you know what that's like. You know what it's like to create something. You can get in the mind of the composer. So essentially, that creative mindset is always the mindset we want to be in when we're playing music, regardless if we're creating music or playing music of others.
Right. Yep.
Because that is the artistic mindset.
For
I
sure.
think the issue sometimes with the training only from the areas of technical proficiency and music of the past, which is what a lot of training can be, is that we forget that sometimes. We can still do that, but if at the front and center of it is not like you are still an artist, you're not a machine.
Right.
I think that other division of labor or whatever happened for all this kind of diffusion and siloing of skill sets and music and everything, that makes sense in terms of like vocation and stuff, but I think the to the detriment sometimes it shortchanges people in the breadth of their artistic understanding. So
Right.
this was a bit of an experiment, but then it's evolved quite a bit, and now so the end result with her, I mentioned her because she was the one that ended up talking to me about joining this global STEAM group, which is a faculty from across the university. It was based on the work I had done with her specifically with improvisation, which she resisted. So, I was not like the popular teacher from doing it. But then because her other teacher in engineering had a similar idea, except it was now technologically focused, place-based technology rather than standardized technology. So now I'm brought into this group. The person who runs the group asked me if I want to go in for a grant to do a cross-disciplinary project, which is going to deal with the relationship between music and engineering, and also learning essentially what you'd think of as place-based or indigenous technologies in music. Which oftentimes that it's kind of like the opposite. So both engineering and music, I think, in very profound ways have become rigid in some ways if you're not careful, because they become so standardized that you forget that that's only one way of doing things. Whereas people coming from different parts of the world that may not even be familiar with these ways of thinking, Western music, Western technology, they may be doing their technology and music that most of the world does that actually different ways.
Right.
And so just to be able to go into the shoes of other people and learn their music, learn different ways of thinking and approaching, and also like bringing the horn into areas it probably hasn't been, which is important these days because we want to have a lot of options. We want to be, we don't want to just like, all I can do is play Mozart.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of music out there and we want to be a part of it. Right.
For sure.
So I think for a lot of reasons, this project became really important. And then it's took us to Bolivia. We worked with Aymara, which is an indigenous group in the Andes Mountains, learning their music and their technology, establishing relationships, meaningful relationships. It was not a trip that we were going to teach anything to them. It was all about learning.
Right.
And deference, actually. And then we recently got back from a trip to Sierra Leone where we did a very similar thing. So, and I learned more in these trips than it was like having 2 degrees of music, in both.
Wow.
I'm not kidding. Like, I mean, I'm still unpacking all of this. And this is and the end result of all this is we're going to write a book about it.
Wow.
And it's related to kind of different the word, now this is a word that's, maybe people may not have heard. Epistemology is a
Hmm.
word it's a philosophical word, and it means a way of knowing. So an epistemology is like a way of knowing something. So I
Right.
know that this will fit together because 2 + 2 = 4, blah, blah, but the thing is, sometimes we know, like we tend to basically assume that the way we know things is the way everybody knows things.
Right.
Then you realize that's just simply not the case.
Right. And you can leave a lot of great things on the table when we don't learn from one another. So,
It's really hard to push yourself out of your own ways of knowing. So for me, these trips were not necessarily fun. I mean, there was a lot of fun in them, but they were really challenging.
mhm.
Like I pushed myself like way outside my comfort zone. I mean,
Wow.
like to the point of, I mean, I don't know if I could push myself further out, maybe going to the moon or something. I mean,
Right.
it really, but that's how you learn. You learn
Yeah.
by pushing yourself out past the boundaries. And then the cool thing at the university is I can take that knowledge, bring it back, sort of synthesize it, and then begin to evolve the studio a bit more. Um, I think part of this work too is important because we talk a lot about making space for different students, and different students come into the university with different musical backgrounds, different musical interests. And I think what I'd like to see in the university is a more and more space for more and more types of students.
Yeah.
So that's really is the mission of the university, but it hasn't always, been like that. So, this is just an example, I think, of what's possible. So I think by opening things up creatively, what happened was you get sort of this diversity in repertoire, like already, because you get people writing music, which is, again, if you tell everybody that they can't improvise and write their own music, of course we're not going to have diversity in music.
Right.
Because no one's going to be writing music, so
Right.
they're just going to be playing the music of the past because they don't think they can even do it.
Right.
And then once you get people doing that, then they start to explore their own ways of thinking. And these are very, just like an indigenous place and its own technology is very unique, an individual's artistic voice is very unique. It's probably going to be very different than the Mozart, it's totally unique. You get this explosion of diversity. And when you have that, the ultimate outcome really was this almost natural integration into not only the more of the music school, but into the university as a whole, which is a representative of all disciplines. So the way I think about the teaching now, this is a little bit high-minded, but rather than thinking about it so learning music in a narrow sense, but really learning music from more of a multidisciplinary sense.
Well, yeah.
It's not getting rid of anything. So, what about the Mozart? It's like, we still got Mozart. In fact, the point is to play it better. The point is actually not to exclude anything. It's really just to make the things that we do better, but also take as big of a breadth as possible. So that's I think I see myself doing more of that,
Well,
and now I'm also taking over the horn camp. So that's a whole nother thing.
Which will be a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
But
so it's just really, and I'm still focusing on my Western solo music. I mean, I just got back from a concert, did Schumann and Datnani, so it's got Brandenburg coming up, all that stuff. But I'm also doing a lot of improvised music. I'm doing more jazz. I'm doing more of my own compositions, and I think that's, where my life is now. And I think we'll be doing more of that. And so that I know that I kind of digressed there. So
you're good. Well, I think that's a good place for us to leave it, so that folks can see all of the, the culmination of all this really high-minded work. That's really exciting to hear. So thank you so much for coming on today and talking with us and sharing your story. I'm sure I can speak for all of my listeners that we could go for another couple hours with you.
I just wish, the only thing I wish is that, you could be talking and describing all the things that you're doing. Because then we could have a 5-hour podcast.
Right. Well, one of these days, maybe we'll flip the tables and I'll let you ask me questions.
There you go. You have to have you on Horn Camp Connect, which is our little, thing we do with Horn Camp. So
for sure. Would love to. All right, Bernhard, have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Mark, what a pleasure. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, bud. Because is produced by Mark Zyla and Jaron Michelle in the studios of WVIK Quad Cities NPR. Thank you for listening to this episode. Because I read Because by Mo Willems, illustrated by Amber Wren, I wanted to learn the becauses of people I admire. Do me a favor and thank someone in your own Because story, and join us next time on Because.